All right, today we're talking about how to keep our vocal and snare separated. I'm not going to give you any magic fix-alls. I'm going to give you real-world problems and solutions and talk about concepts and show the application of them so you can take something away from this video and use it in the future on your projects. So let's get on into it. So here is the lead vocal and the snare soloed out with most of the effects turned off so we can just take a look at the frequency spectrum that they're inhabiting.
Gonna charge right into the giant's lair.
So here's a snapshot of what's going on. I have the spectrum analyzer set to the slow, less detailed trend over time. And we can see on the vocal here on the left that the clarity region in the high mids is anywhere between 1.5K and 4K. This is where a lot of the clarity and enunciation of the vocal is cutting through. And we'll see that in the snare over here, the bulk of the high mid information in the snare that's cutting through the mix is just above that region of the vocal. And that is ideal. Now, in general, the 2.5K region is crucial for a vocal, and it's often crucial for a snare as well. And it's usually somewhere in the 3 to 5K range that we have the trouble with the separation. The low thud of the snare, this big, beefy, bassy part of the snare is super crucial for it having a big presence in the mix. So I want to make sure that any frequencies my vocal's taking up in this region are compressed really good. I always compress the lower part of the vocal harder than the upper range of the vocal. I leave the dynamics in the mids primarily, but the low stuff should be nice and compressed. And you'll also see that around 500 to 700 hertz, there's a lot of mid presence here. This is a big space right here in the snare for the vocal to occupy. Now, that's not the clarity region, but it is really important for them to not be stepping on each other. So in general, we want the low thud fundamental of the snare to have a presence in the bassier regions below the vocal, and the high mid clarity of the vocal should have a little hole there of its own, and then just above that, we can offer space to the high mid clarity of the snare. The 5K range is more like the sibilant range, 5, 6, 7 right in here. This is where we can get a lot of harshness and sibilance from a vocal. This is where the de-esser is typically operating, and this is a good place for a snare to shine through, but it can be harsh on a snare drum as well, so it should be compressed pretty heavily to keep it from getting harsh. So that's just a basic overview of where these two things are living in the spectrum and how they're separated. And then when we get up into the high frequencies, like above 10K, a lot of times you hear that referred to as the air. We're going to want to have separate places for the vocal air than the snare air. We want some separation up there as well. And we will come back to these high frequencies, but let's move on now and talk about some frequency masking.
Gonna charge right into the giant's lair, looking down my barrel to meet that.
When it comes to a human voice, the 2 to 3K range is where the enunciation and clarity is. And that can change depending on if you have a tenor or a soprano, sure, but the way we hear clarity and enunciation from other human beings lives somewhere in that range. Now, when it comes to frequency masking, 2.5K is directly masked by 250 hertz. Just like 2K is masked by 200 hertz, 3K is masked by 300 hertz. This is a really important mixing concept if you're not aware of it. Low mid frequencies mask the high mid frequencies. And what I mean by that is, if you need more clarity in the 2.5K range of any sound, a vocal or whatever, yes, you can boost that range, but you can also decrease the 250 range. By dipping out at 250, 2.5 will sound more clear. So the answer isn't always boosting where you need it. The answer is equally cutting where you don't need it. And one of the videos I'm going to link to in the description of this is one that I have called Everything Affects Everything, and it covers some basic concepts of frequency masking. If you're new to it, you might enjoy that video. It talks about a lot of other good stuff as well. But we have to keep this concept in mind for our snare and for our vocal. So we don't just want to be boosting everything, we also want to be cutting the low mids where we don't need them to get the high mids to shine through. For clarity of vocals and a clarity of snare, which both need a presence somewhere in the high mids, What you want to do is get in with your spectrum analyzer and listen to where the clarity on your particular vocalist is.
Gonna charge right into the giant's lair, looking down my barrel to meet that.
So you can hear where we get up above 5K, where it gets brittle. This is the sibilant region. And this is 1.5K, which is important, but the real enunciation and clarity starts to come in right in here. This is where we hear the differentiation between the syllables and the words. And right here, this is at 3K.
Gonna put it right between.
And this is at about 2.5. So this is where the human ear really starts to tell what the other person is saying. So that's the important region. So you'd get in with your spectrum analyzer, figure out where that is on your vocal, and if it's 2.5, 3K, you're probably going to need to remove some 250 to 300 hertz, and that will make that higher mid region sound more clear. And when it comes to the snare drum, wanting to occupy the same 2.5, 3K region, you're going to want to adapt the snare around the vocal. You're going to want to pick whether the snare needs to shine through at 3.5 or more at, say, 2 or 1.5, or maybe both. You're going to want to leave that space for the vocal and not have the snare competing with it in that crucial space. That's the point here. And being aware of the frequency masking of the low mids will help you dial in that clarity in the high mids, because they directly affect one another. So in this case, this vocal needed the 2.5 range, so it has a fairly significant dip in the 250 range and a boost in the 2.5K range, but you don't want to hollow out too much in 250 or it'll sound thin, and you don't want to boost too much in 2.5 or your overall mix will just have too much high mid information. So there's a balance there. And then we did the same thing with the snare, and let me show you the snare again. So both the vocal and the snare have important clarity information in that 2.5, 3K range, but the vocal always takes precedence. So with EQs and dynamic EQs, I tamed that range in the snare and let the vocal have that space, and then I accent the snare slightly above that, which gets into the 5K range where the sibilance of the vocal is, and that's where the de-essers are working, and I'm trying to tame the vocal. And then below the high mid clarity range, we have the regular mid frequencies, say between 300 hertz or so and maybe 800-900, where you really don't need that much of the snare drum present. You need a little, but you can dial a lot of that way back and leave a hole there for the vocals, guitars, and everything else. And below the mid frequencies and above the frequencies of the kick drum, we have a place for the snare to take up a big presence. It's fundamental, second harmonic. Those can drive through really big, somewhere in between 1 and 200 hertz. And that low fundamental presence of the snare combined with the high mids will carry the snare through the mix very well. And the muddy range of the vocal that we dialed back between 2 and 300, that is also space for things like the snare drum, bass guitar, piano, stuff like that. So far, we've covered the fact that each of these, vocal and snare, need their own space in the frequency spectrum to highlight, to shine through, and we want to make sure those are slightly different from each other. And we've talked about the frequency masking between the low mids and high mids, which help you dial this in without simply boosting too much. If you're also cutting in the low mids, then you don't have to boost as much in the high mids to get those places to shine through. And then we considered the fundamentals. The root note frequency, the fundamental of the snare drum, typically falls above the kick drum and below the vocal register. That usually happens naturally, which is great, and we want to take advantage of that. But if you want to keep a good low-end presence in your vocal, you want to have that low end compressed so it's dynamically under control, and you don't necessarily need the bassy parts of the vocal right where that fundamental of the snare is. You want to leave those frequencies for the snare, and the bassiness of your vocal should be on either side of that fundamental. So let's take a look at some dynamic EQ work that is on this snare bus, and we'll show you the boost and adjustments we made to the fundamental, and then we'll talk about the high air white noise. And you can see where that low beefiness is cutting through the mix here. This is set at about 100 hertz. The snare had a lot of information on its own at 200 and 250, but it didn't have a lot at 100, which is where I really wanted the beefy presence of the snare to cut through. So I didn't have to boost the snare at all at 200 or 250, but I did need to boost it down towards 100 hertz. And this is a pretty big boost with a fairly narrow Q. The Q is 1.33. And you have to be careful with this, because if you do too big of a boost and too narrow of a Q and a low frequency, you will cause yourself a ringing effect, which you want to avoid. A touch of ringing can be pleasant, which is what I have going on here, but I cannot make this boost any narrower or steeper. We'll get a ringing effect right there. So with the low frequency presence of the snare dominating at around 100 hertz, everything below that we high passed out. Now the next thing that this snare needed was a nice mid boost around 1.6K, which is just below that crucial 2 to 3K vocal clarity range. And the snare sounds great there, which is very convenient. But that's also part of this recipe here. When it comes to finding places for each one to live, is you need accents on slightly either sides of each other. So the snare has a presence above the vocal clarity range, but it also has a presence right below it. And this is slightly different than the presence of the crack of the kick drum. It's also slightly different than the presence of my guitar bus. All those need to kind of nuzzle into place. The other one, when it comes to the high air, is this one up here. This is at 13.7K. Now, I have vocal air at around 12K, and I have more vocal air up at around 16K. So again, there's vocal air going on here and here, but right here is a spot, we'll call it an air pocket, for the snare. The snare drum has to have air that shines through the mix. So I'm going to play you the mix again, and we're going to toggle these two right here on and off.
Gonna charge right into the giant's lair, looking down my barrel to meet that demon stare. Put it right between them eyes.
Yeah. So super crucial. And the most important thing to remember is that neither of these are interfering with the vocal. And the final thing I wanted to show you about this whole recipe of vocal and snare separation is mid-side. Now, both the snare and the vocal have exciters and saturators just in the high end. That is in a video I just did a little bit ago called the Sparkle Bus, where I show that technique. So I'll link to that video as well. But the gist of it is that the frequencies that the vocal is getting boosted up here in the highs is only in the mids. And it's the opposite for the snare. The snare is only getting boosted in this range above 5K in the sides. So when you combine all of those, it simply equates to enhanced separation. And this EQ is on the Sparkle Bus, not on the vocal, by the way. Now, in the low mids and low frequencies, the snare is centered in the middle channel. Not a lot of side information in the snare down there, but when it comes to the high mids, that's where I will push the snare off to the sides and leave the vocals in the middle. So any boost for the vocal in the 2.5 range will be in the mids. And any boost for the snare, whether it was the one at 1.6 or up at 5K, that will be in the sides only. Now here I have a boost in the snare that is only in the sides, and that's right at 3K. And this is getting right in the middle of that region of our vocal where the clarity is. So I am giving it a little presence there, but only in the sides. And that's crucial because the boost that the vocal is getting in this region are only in the mids. So we can give the snare and the vocal a boost in the same area. As long as we separate it from mid to side, that rectifies a whole bunch of that problem. And I made this dynamic as well, so the overall 3K boost would not get out of control. So you can see sometimes it's got a little boost, but if the snare's too loud, it will dip it back down out of the way. If you simply give anything too much 3K or 4 or 5K, your mix is going to get harsh because those are just harsh frequencies. But yes, you want to separate things in mid-side, at least in the high mids and highs. And I keep the vocal down the middle. Even with all of the boosting, I just put the boosting in the mids, and above 1K, if I'm giving the snare any boost, I'll put it over in the sides. But that's the mid-side takeaway here, is there's lots of subtle mid-side things going on between this vocal and snare, but they're always opposite each other. But there you go. I will link to all 3 of those videos that are related to these topics in the description here. But just to recap, we need to make a place in our frequency spectrum for each the snare and the vocal, and we want them to be different from each other. We want to nudge them around each other and give them little holes to live. And while we're doing that, we want to keep in mind the frequency masking between the low mids and the high mids. That helps us gain clarity for each instrument on its own, so we don't end up doing too much boosting. And then when it comes to the high air, anything above 10K, you got to remember that snare needs a big presence up there. But we find a different home in the frequency spectrum for the air on the snare than the air on the vocal, and we further separate them with mid-side. And then we want to make sure we keep the fundamental of the snare below the vocal. If you need bass in your vocal, make sure it's not in that same spot where the low thud of the snare is. You either highlight it slightly below or slightly above, but the fundamental of the snare has its own pocket there that the vocal is not stepping on, and that's the important part there. But if you follow those techniques, even though every vocal and every snare is different, that'll give you a lot to go on about how to navigate separate living space for each one of them to occupy. But there you go. I hope you enjoyed that. Let me know what you think in the comments. I hope you check out those other videos, and I'll catch you on the next one.